Hi everyone, I'm Renee Hiatt of Sew on the Go. Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday. This is week 4. We're going to continue working on my bloom pattern. We're going to work on our V-star block, making our square units this week. Last week we focused on the V block, otherwise known as the Peaky and Spike or 5440 and Fight. We made that with our Studio 180 Design V-block tool. This week we're going to use the square squared. You could use the large squared if you don't have the regular square squared, but since all of our units are under 6.5 inches, the square squared unit works perfect. So we have two different two different square squared units in this particular block. We have our V-star centers that are made with our accent 3 in the center, and then we're using our assorted brights in the four side triangles. Then we also have the petal squared is what I call it, unit, which has our accent 1 in the center, and then our accent 3 on 2 sides, and our background on 2 sides. We're going to make 64 of these units, and 2 times 8, 2 per assorted bright, 8 assorted brights, so we're going to end up with 16 of these centers, and that's what we're focused on this week. So let's head on over to the sewing machine and get started. Okay, we're back over at the sewing station now, and I'm going to start with the centers. We are going to make 2 per assorted bright. So we have 2 Bloom V-Star blocks in the quilt, 2 of each color, each fabric. So we're going to set up our plate for success. Like I mentioned, when I cut, we have the centers lined up in the center, and then I've divided those 8 half square triangles into the 4 corners, so only 2 per corner, because we just need 2 of these units per assorted bright. So a lot of people, they'll go ahead and just stack up all their half square triangles in one stack, and they'll start sewing, and then they'll have attached 8 of these half square triangles to 8 centers, and they'll run out of centers and wonder why. And that's because you don't need to do that. Most common mistake, by the way, when I teach this in class, even though I say the same thing. So you want to make sure that you're putting 2 of each color in each stack. Okay? Now, your 1/4 inch is extremely important in this unit. Not a scant 1/4 inch, but a 1/4 inch. So you're going to want to go ahead and make sure that you're testing and checking your 1/4 inch to make sure that when, especially if you use a flange on the side of your foot, that you are putting that quilter's magic wand against the actual flange, and that your needle is going to come down and hit that center line, and that will ensure that you're using a good 1/4 inch. I also recommend just making 2 of these units first all the way through and checking to make sure that you don't run into any problems. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So we are going to, and I'm just going to make 2 on the tape. You're going to want to see it, flip it, and sew it. So we are going to focus on just the 2 sides first. So I'm going to put these other 2 sides aside. We're going to put 2 half square triangles on first, our side triangles, and then we will put the other 2 on. We want to, because we precision cut our centers with that squared tool, we want to make sure that these are always on top when we sew. This has been oversized, and we have a little bit of wiggle room. There's no need for you to fold this in half, and make sure that you've lined it up perfect. You can't go completely rogue, but as long as you go ahead and place it pretty close to the center, you're going to be fine. So once again, I'm going to start with my needle down position because I have the hover. And I'm going to go ahead and stick my unit under there. And if you are sewing with a flange, another thing that I've noticed that a lot of people have a habit of doing is shoving their unit up against that flange. And the flange is there as a guide, just like the edge of the foot if you're using a foot with a 1/4 inch foot without a flange. And just because, by the way, your manufacturer says it's a 1/4 inch foot, you need to check it. You know, they're not all built the same, if you would. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start my sewing here. And I want to make sure I'm putting down the best 1/4 inch on my center. Like I said, I have a little wiggle room in my half square triangles. So I'm going to go ahead, see it as it should be, flip it, see it, flip it, sew it. Again, I don't pin. You are welcome to pin. If my units get a little bigger, then I would actually start pinning. All right, so now I'm going to take this over and press it. Okay, so now I'm over on my wool mat, which I love and use. They come in all different sizes, and I do have a couple that are up on my website if you are interested in them. Just my favorite sizes I carry. So again, here's a good time to check to make sure that when you put the edge of that magic wand on your stitching line, that the edge of your unit actually hits that center line here. Before you get too crazy in making units. All right, so again, we're going to set our seam, which will drop our stitching line down, our stitching thread down into the fabric. We're going to finger press again. These can get really wonky if you go ahead and do that shoving technique. All right, so we're going to go ahead and just give them a nice, good press. Some people put 2 sides on and then press. I find that they often are knocking the other side of their unit when they do that, so I do 1 at a time. All right, let's go back and sew on our next set of half square triangles. Okay, so back at our sewing machine, I've placed them back on my plate to make sure that I have my orientation correct, and then I'm going to rotate my plate and go ahead and do my see it, flip it, sew it for these. Just move this out. So we're just going to focus on these 2 units. So see it, flip it. Going to split the difference then again, my needle down, and go ahead and start my stitching here. Once you get these checked out, by all means go ahead and just power sew away. But it's really important that you make sure that your 1/4 inch is proper before you go crazy in sewing too many of these. Oh, it sounds like the FedEx man is here. Jax is going a little crazy. Apologize. These dogs, they're always trying to get into the pictures, you know. All right. So now I'm going to go press these other sides again. Alrighty. So I didn't want to bore you. The pressing is the same. Make sure you set your seam, finger press, press. Now we have these dog ears, so I'm going to put these here so you can see. If you use a flange like I do, or even if you don't, these will add a lot of extra bulk to your unit, so it's really best to go ahead and trim them down. Now some folks will trim these with a rotary cutter and a ruler, perfectly fine. Just make sure that you're not cutting off of anything off of that center square. Myself, I just usually go ahead and trim it with my scissors, just using cutting from the back, using that center square as my guide, and I just trim them off. It also gives you a good opportunity to make sure that you've pressed well, and that you don't have any lips on your unit, because you're double checking it as you go here, and you're cleaning it up, and it gives you a good opportunity to see how well you did your pressing before you add on that next set. Also gives you time to catch up and talk to somebody if you're actually sewing alongside someone else. All right, so now we're going to, let me just get rid of these. See, the paper plate's good for more than just eating and labeling your quilt units. Now, ideally, I would put this back on my plate, and I turn it so that I can see now these are my next 2 sets of triangles that I'm going to put on. So again, I'm going to see it, flip it, and you're going to put that center square on top. And here is where you really want to, if you don't pin, which I don't, you want to give a little bit of, you don't want to stretch, but you want to make sure that you're holding this unit flat. If you see people who have a wavy center block, it could be pressing, but most often it's because when they're speed sewing and they're not pinning, their feed dogs are actually pushing this side triangle in at a faster speed than the top is moving. And that's how they end up with some puckering. So if you're not using pins, you just want to make sure you're giving it a little pressure to keep it nice and flat. So I'm going to put my needle down and go ahead. And remember, you want to just put your unit right up against that flange if you're using a flange, or the edge of your foot. A 1/4 inch is very, very key here. And then you're going to go ahead and do it again. Oops. And you don't want to push it up against that edge. All right, I'll be right back. I'm going to go press these. All right, we're back, and I've placed my units back on the plate to get my orientation. Again, not as important with this particular unit, but I do it as a habit, because if you repeat and make something a repeatable step, you'll find that you are making less errors. And then it doesn't really matter which particular unit you're working on, you're always being careful. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate my plate so that I can do my see it, flip it, sew it. I'll just take these off here since we're just working with these two. So see it, flip it. Again, I'm going to provide just a little pressure there as I put it through my machine, just to make sure it doesn't get wavy. I sew on a Foth, so it has the IDT, which is basically like having a walking foot all the time. So it really doesn't do it as often, but, you know, I just think if you utilize good piecing skills all the time, irrelevant of the machine you're using or the unit you're making, you'll find yourself being much more successful. All right, so I'm going to take you over to the pressing station with me to cover this last press for this unit. Okay, so we're back over at the pressing. I'm going to just separate these because they just need a little room once they get all these side triangles on them. And again, I'm going to set my seam and finger press. You want to make sure, you know, you got those nice clean corners. So if you find that it's kind of cockeyed, it could be your sewing, and it could be your pressing. And I'm going to show you in a second here how you can figure that out. All right, a nice good pressing. Now is when I will apply a nice little mist of Best Press from my mister. Just something that's light. I've gone ahead and pressed it a couple times. As I mentioned in the preparing your fabric video, Best Press will usually reactivate itself with a little bit of steam each time. You really just need to apply it probably every 3rd to 4th time that you are pressing. I always try and do it right before I trim my units down, which I know is going to be next. So I spoke a few seconds ago about, you know, if your lines are not straight, it could be your pressing. A way to see that is to look at the back of your unit, and you really want to see some nice clean 1/4 inch seams with a 1/4 inch boxed out with your thread lines in the corner, and that lets you know that your sewing is pretty perfect. And then you would know from the front if you had something wonky. I do not, thank goodness. It could be your pressing, so double check to make sure you don't have any lips. Like you can see here, I have a little lip in here. So I'm just going to give that a little press. All right. So now we're ready for trimming. So I'm going to take you over to the cutting table. Okay. So now we are back over at the cutting area, or I should say we're at the cutting area. We're going to use our squared ruler, and when we cut our centers, we used this side of the ruler, the side with the verbiage that showed us the center square for the 3-inch finish, 4-inch finished, or 5-inch finished. And now we're going to use the other side of the squared. If you're using the large square, you would have used the A ruler to cut your centers and your B unit to cut your units down. So we are going to come off this corner. If you're right-handed, you're going to hold it horizontal, so the width is in the, is wider, and you're going to come across the top here and either find your 3-inch crosshair, 4-inch crosshair, or your 5-inch. And this is your cut size, or excuse me, your finish size. So we have a 3-inch finish, 4-inch finish, or 5-inch finish, depending on which side of the unit. And then once we find that, we're going to find the full square there, whether or not we're doing the 3 or the 4 or the 5. And then after we do our first 2 cuts, we'll come down and then we'll use the actual size unit, whether or not we're making the 3.5, 4.5, or 5.5. So I'll show you that right now. So we're going to get our unit, and I'll do the right-handed first, and then we'll go through the left-handed. The left-handed folks are just going to hold it so that the words are closest to them. So let's do our right-handed first. So again, horizontal, and you're going to line up your 3s, and mine always just sit 2 threads outside my square when I use my perfect 1/4 inch, and I am totally okay with that. And the reason being is that I'm just going to split the difference on all 4 sides, is that when I come in with my 1/4 inch seam, I'm never going to worry that I'm going to hit that corner. It'll always, after I go through and press, it'll always show all 4 points of the corners. So you can see that it's just a perfect 2 or 3 threads outside of the unit when I'm using my perfect 1/4 inch. Some people feel they need to do a scant to get it in closer. To me, like I said, I'm perfectly fine with it, because when I go and sew it, it will be perfect when I press it. All right, so I'm just going to split the difference across here, and I'm going to go ahead and cut up the right side, and then come in about a 1/2 inch in and do that little roll back and go forward. Oops. When you know it. I'm just at a funky angle here with my camera, so apologies. Let me just redo that particular one. All right. And then we're going to turn that around. And now we're going to line up our 2 sides with the 3.5. And that should drop our crosshairs right back in. And I'm going to go ahead and trim my remaining 2 sides. So up the side, and then let me get in here with the camera and cut those last 2 sides, which will give me a perfect, I'm back to having rotary problems. It's just, unfortunately, because of the placement of my camera today, that's in the way of my right hand, so I apologize. So for my lefties, we're going to hold the ruler so that the long ways is up and down. So the words are closest to my belly. And again, I'm lining up, and I'm just a few hairs outside, that my unit, my center square unit is a few, threads inside the line. All right. So I'm going to cut up the left, come in an inch, do a little roll back, and go forward. It must be another rotary. I was doing a lot of cutting. So anyhow, so I'm going to flip that 180 degrees. And then I'm going to line up the outer two edges and go ahead and cut. And come in a few threads in and cut, giving me a perfect center unit. And when I put these up against each other, they're all the same size. So anytime it's taken me with trimming them, I'm going to see when I go to put my units together. The other thing that's fabulous is a lot of people who make these from, you know, just the plain method, the standard method, they end up stretching these half square triangles because they end up short. With this, you don't need to worry about that. So you're going to go ahead and continue making them for your other colors. Keep going through all 8 colors, and you'll have a total of 16 of those. Then we're going to move on to your petal square squared. Now this has your accent 1 in the center, and it has your accent 2, known as pink, on 2 sides, and your white on 2 sides, your background, which might be a different color. It's very, very important that you make sure you have them set up properly and that you take the time to sew the proper side on at a time. This is why I mentioned to you when you put the units back on your plate to make sure that you have your orientation properly, lined up properly. All right, so I'm just going to take you through it. I won't take you back to the machine. We're going to first focus on, hold on one second, let me just bring this back. What I do end up doing is I take my background squares off and I just focus on putting on my pink together first. And then I come back and put my background side triangles on. So you're going to do the same thing with that. You're going to see it, flip it, and sew it. You're going to sew on the 1/2 square triangle on and press it. Make sure you remember you're setting your seam, finger pressing, and pressing. Next, you'll put your 2 sides on, and then you're going to turn it over after you get it pressed and trim off those dog ears. Then you will put it back in your plate and go ahead and put your background 1/2 square triangles on now. So you'll do the same thing with see it, flip it, and sew it, making sure again your center square is on top. And put down your best 1/4 inch, set your seam, finger press and press back to your plate until you get, your 2 others on, your other side on, press, finger press, and press. And then you will trim it down to perfection with your square squared, making sure you're lining up with your proper size in the center there. Remember, don't get worried if you're a few threads inside, that your square is a few threads inside. When you would have to worry is when your square is outside those lines, or if these are wonky, but these are straight and they fit perfectly. 2 threads basically outside, the line falls about 2 threads outside my center square, and as I've said, I'm perfectly good with that. And then we will be putting these together in a couple weeks. So right now you don't need to worry about doing that. You just need to worry about finishing all of your center squares to 8, 2 per assorted brights, and then your petal square squares where you have your accent 1 in the middle, your accent 2 on 2 sides, and your background on the other 2 sides, and you're going to make 64 of those. Apologies, I'm fighting a sinus infection, so I'm not quite myself today, but I'm hoping you were able to follow along. Well, that wraps us up for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you will follow me on my Facebook page as well as my YouTube channel, my newsletter. I'm doing a lot of great things. I have a new mystery kicking off in a couple weeks. So I'm going to start talking about that in my weekly Friday newsletter. So make sure you subscribe to my newsletter as well as follow me on Facebook, Instagram. All those wonderful links will be splashed at the end of this video. We will, next week we're going to stay with the square and a square units using our square squared ruler, but we will be moving on to the 5 diamond block where we are going to make our star point squares, squared, and that is this unit. And then we're going to also focus on the center for those blocks. So, very similar in technique. It's really going to be keeping yourself organized and managed, but I'm going to throw in a couple extra tips next week since we'll be repeating the same unit. So be sure to check in. All right? Make sure you post those units on my Sewing Circle group. Talk to you later.